Okay. I'll give a short bio of Dr. Hooman Motamed, and then I'll ask him to share his screen. So Dr. Hooman Motamed is a disaster risk specialist with more than 10 years of experience in multi-hazard disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Having a PhD in earthquake engineering, he has obtained his second master in insurance and risk management from Bayes Business School, formerly known as the Cass School, University of London. He has been involved in many national, regional, and international projects at different levels, and currently he is an associate professor in Research Center for Risk Management at the International Institute of Earthquake Engineering and Seismology in Tehran. Dr. Motamed, we're honored to have you here today. Whenever you're ready, please share your screen, and the floor is all yours. Okay, I can see your presentation. I can see it full screen. You just have to unmute yourself. We still can't hear you. I think you have to unmute yourself. I'll just ask for unmute.
Okay, I think now you can hear me.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Arash, for the introduction. The presentation I'm going to make today is about the results we obtained from the project carried out in Iran under the name of development of an insurance earthquake risk model for buildings, residential buildings in Iran. Yeah. Okay, in today's presentation, we have different parts that I'm going to describe. First, we go through a short sort of introduction about the geography of Iran and the sort of natural hazards that regularly occurs in the country, and then I will provide some information about the insurance practice and how different products are offered by governmental and private insurance, and then we're going to focus on the model itself, its components, namely hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and then we're going to see risk results and the distribution of different risk metrics in Iran. And then I'm going to introduce a very short one, a software that we have developed for running the model, which can also be used by private sector in the insurance industry. And at the end, we have conclusions and questions and answers. Well, as you can see, both number and the impact of disasters, be it geological or hydrometeorological ones, or man-made, are growing, and that's because we have a worldwide rapid and uncontrolled urbanization, where people, the excess of population, are attracted to the large cities, mainly in the vicinity of the city, in the suburbs or in slums particularly. And this concentration of population in cities will result in accumulation of population, wealth, and activities of people in those areas. And because of the high demand for the housing, and the uneven distribution of knowledge and technology and construction practice in different countries, we witness a poor construction, especially in hazardous zones, like the zones threatened by landsliding, or in the riparian zones of that could be flooded and in future, and other periods as well. So that is translated in an increase in disaster loss worldwide, but those losses and disasters has resulted in less human fatality in developed countries, but on the other side, in less developed countries, you can still witness a high number of fatalities in the event of those hazards. And Iran is no exception. The urban population has increased from 30% of the country's population in 1956 to about 75% in 2020. There are still constructions taking place in hazardous zone where seismic hazard level is high, or in the lowlands that could be threatened by floods. Although we have a regularly updated construction code, which is of acceptable quality, but there's still a gap between regulations and construction practice, leading to an increase in vulnerability of buildings. Similar to many other places, disaster risk management is still focused on emergency response and not in disaster risk reduction. And public awareness towards natural hazards is still low. So it's not a priority for people, for example, to think about how to reduce their exposure or risk to natural hazards. The country has a high risk profile comprised of different periods, namely earthquake, flood, drought, sand and dust storm, the most recent. And however, there are also promising things like new regulations, like the disaster risk management law in 2019 and the natural catastrophe insurance pool law in 2020. Well, earthquake could be the first sort of peril in Iran. We have witnessed lots of destructive events over the past decades. I've brought some information on the financial loss of these disasters. For example, on a magnitude 7.4 earthquake in 1978 in relatively rural areas resulted in 11 million USD. But as we witnessed strong events in larger urban areas, medium-sized cities like Manji-Rudbar and the Nassirpour in 2017, the amount of financial losses has grown. So the last major event in 2017, where this picture is here, has been resulted in 3.5 billion USD for a medium-small size city in Western Iran. So far, thank God that we have not had a destructive event in large cities. But if it happens, the results would be quite different. For example, we simulated an event in east of the Tehran, at the capital city, with about 12 million population. Magnitude 6.5 earthquake could result in 10 to 20 billion USD direct loss to the city. Of course, the indirect loss would be could be even higher because Tehran is the economic capital as well as political capital of the country. Well, the insurance coverage for national hazards has been provided for several decades. So this is a product that could be easily found on the market now. We have online insurance aggregators that you could easily buy a policy for your home to cover risk from earthquake, flood, or other natural hazards. However, no catastrophe model is used for pricing in the insurance industry in Iran. And the solvency capital is calculated using a factor base, something similar to what we had in Solvency 1 in the Europe. And the penetration rate of insurance is very low compared to other countries, 2.7%. And very soon, the national mandatory catastrophe insurance scheme will be in place to provide a basic coverage to a range of natural hazards on a nationwide scale. So the project development of Iran earthquake risk model was designed to support Iran National Catastrophe Pool as an independent entity in pricing a nationwide NatCat coverage. The project took 1 year and it was sponsored jointly by Insurance Research Center of Iran, as well as the International Institute of Earthquake Engineering and Seismology, IIEES. And the project was implemented by a multidisciplinary team in IIEES. And in addition to the analytics, maps, tables, and everything, a web-based tool accompanies the project output for the ease of use by Iran NatCat Pool IPSIP. Okay, this is a familiar diagram that shows a skeleton of a normal, conventional catastrophe risk model. It combines three main components of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and then produce results as risk metrics that could be used by different entities and organizations, including insurance industry, but also by disaster risk management organizations, investment companies, etc. So in the development of the earthquake model, we have followed the same sort of process, and we have developed each and any of these components in order to complete the entire model. This is the methodology. These are the steps that were taken to come up with the final results as risk metrics. We first prepared a simulation of earthquake events for a long period of time, which is 500K years. And then we calculated the seismic hazard field for each of these events. We prepared an exposure data set for 24 building types in more than 80,000 locations across the country, and also parallelly prepared a PGA-based vulnerability set of curves for those 24 building types using past studies, recent earthquake loss data, as well as the expert opinion. And then we combine all this information using a calculation platform to calculate the damage to each of these buildings. You can imagine the size of the calculations. I've brought here, for example, 24 multiplied by 80,000 multiplied by 500,000 calculation becomes something billion, tens of hundreds of million calculations, billion calculations. And then after coming up with the damage results, we calculate the financial loss for buildings using the market value of those residential buildings existing in the exposure model, and taking into account the age of buildings and the type of construction in the valuation of the those buildings. And then after that, we do some statistical analyses over this long list of information to produce risk metrics such as AAL, EPICs, and coefficient of variations at different levels, for example, county, province, and country. Well, I'm going to provide a very brief information of each component, starting by the hazard component. Although we had two choices, one using the conventional PSHA, which actually follows the methodology proposed by Bonnet in 1968, which actually uses an integration of different sort of parameters in PSHA to come up with a curve of hazard accidents probability for each area of calculation, let's say each location. However, this technique is not really common in the insurance industry, so people use other techniques called Monte Carlo based PSHA that usually use the simulation of different realization of possible seismic events in the country, and then calculate the hazard and loss for that event separately, and then carry out a statistical calculation on the long list of those loss results to come up with the final actual risk metrics. So that the methodology we used in this study has been Monte Carlo for the hazard component. This is the result of the hazard components for 500,000 years. You can see lots of small, medium, and large events generated in different zones and locations in the country. Only a small portion of country in the center, which has a sort of stable geological characteristic, has less events, but other parts of the country, particularly to the northwest, southeast, and the north, has medium and large events that could pose large risk to the residential buildings. And this is the actually the hazard maps for different return periods, 100-year hazard map to the left and 475-year hazard map to the right. You can see that the level of seismic hazard is higher in the right map, which is normal because it relates to a longer return period. And some areas that that had less seismic activities in the 100-year that become more active, for example, in the south of the country, the south center of the country, and to some constant extent to the west of the country. And then we developed an exposure modules here. The information has been extracted from national census, two consecutive national census, one in 2011, the second one in 2016. And then we combined those information because there were different sort of fields in each of them. So we had to use both of them, combine them, updated the first one with information of the second one to come up with a sort of exposure model. We also redistribute that information using auxiliary maps, for example, a very refined population distribution in Iran, and then come up with the exposure map for different classes of residential buildings at 5 kilometer pixel in the country. To have a yes. So as you can see, the steel residential buildings, we have concentration of such buildings in major cities, for example, in Tehran and in Isfahan. And then for the RC buildings, we have the same pattern, as well as a good portion of reinforced concrete residential buildings in the northern strip of the country, just beneath the Caspian Sea to the north. And here we can also see the exposure map of other type of buildings. The left one is adobe buildings, which is now less common in the country, but some old residential buildings still exist in some areas, especially in areas that mud is available for building such sort of homes, especially in Isfahan and in Kerman, which we witnessed the 2003 earthquake of Bam in this region. And this is the masonry sort of type that is very common. About half of the buildings are still of masonry types. You can see that it's almost everywhere in the country, some concentration around the major cities, Tehran, Isfahan, Avaz, Shiraz, and Mashhad to the northeast. After having the classification of building types, we had to develop vulnerability curves before starting the damage calculation. So in order to that, we combine some reliable studies that have developed and proposed curves for the prevalent Iranian buildings. We combined those information. We had to change the format of the those curves. For example, some of which were developed as a, for example, in the different parameters instead of PGA. We had to change that, so we sort of harmonized everything into PGA-based vulnerability curves. Then we validated those results using the most recent loss data, especially data collected by us and colleagues in the Kermanshah earthquake of 2017, and a more recent but smaller earthquake in the northwest in Azerbaijan. So you can see here 24 types of vulnerability curves for those buildings that were saved into database of exposure models. So now that everything is ready, we combine those information. We relate the ratio of damage at each location using the level of hazard in terms of PGA and the type of construction, and then we converted damage using the value of residential buildings into loss, and then we did a sort of statistical calculation to come up with the risk metrics here. Here we can see the you can see the average annual loss of residential buildings for different types in terms of square meter, because of the inflation. It was decided that we calculate the loss in terms of the area instead of the financial value, so we can convert it to different sort of monetary presentation at the time we want a financial figure. So what you see is the square meter of the damaged residential buildings. These are the steel buildings. These are the RC buildings. We can see that wherever that we have this sort of construction, for example, in Isfahan and Tehran, we have some levels of medium to strong sort of damages to these areas. And since we had the RC also to the northern strip beneath the Caspian Sea, there are also degrees of damages in those areas. And then the same principle applies for the other countries. Here you can see the masonry damages to masonry buildings. You can see that everywhere, almost everywhere in the country, we have a high risk of high risk for masonry buildings to earthquakes. And then here we calculated the pure premium rate for those buildings using the AAL and also the exposure of the country at each pixel, and then we aggregated those pixels at the county level and come up with the results of pure premium risk here. In contrast to the previous maps that we had sort of pronounced sort of levels of damage to some areas, the ratio actually follows a different pattern. So because the ratio the pure premium ratio also dependent on the exposure of the area as well. So it's a ratio and not a sort of only the exposure value. And then we can see here that in some areas that maybe the level of risk, the AAL, average annual loss, are not really high. The ratio is high, meaning that these areas should pay more insurance premium if they want to get a similar protection to other parts of the country. And these are the pure premium ratio results for more vulnerable types of buildings, namely adobe to the left and masonry to the right. We can see that the rate of insurance is much higher compared to these engineered constructed buildings. So maybe we can deduce here that providing a protection for some sorts of building types in some areas would not be economical, and these buildings are basically not insured. That is something that can be learned from these maps. And then here we have a table on the pure premium rate for the entire country, for the building side to the left, and different combination of deductibles and limits in order to give more flexibility to the Iran cat insurance pool to sort of design its suitable product everywhere in terms of affordability and also in terms of providing sufficient coverage. So Yes. So as you can see here, when we have no deductible and the limit is 100%, we have these sort of rates. But when we have higher deductible and lower limit, the rates are reduced to half approximately, which makes it more affordable for the pool to design their sort of products. And then actually, we used the results of the pure premium rates and then validated those figures and risk levels using past studies on risk, seismic hazard, and also the judgments of the colleagues on how different counties in Iran could be vulnerable to the earthquake hazard in future. So this is the final map that will be used by the by IPSIP, Iran Building Catastrophe Insurance Risk Pool, to calculate the level of premium to be collected from the countries. As you can see, the risk profile of the counties in the northwestern Iran near the major city of Tabriz, it is very high. We have also in central Iran, in the Kerman and in the Kerman province, we have also some high profile. Here also to the northeast, we have some counties of very high risk. In order to have a comparison between the practice currently followed by the Iranian insurance to price earthquake risk products and the sort of pricing that we have come up with using our risk-based model, I've selected two sort of provinces with different risk profiles. As you can see here, the West Azerbaijan has a high risk profile. Sorry, the East Azerbaijan has a high seismic risk profile. In contrast, Kurdistan to the west has a lower one. So we assume that two hypothetic FAMs of FAM A and FAM B provide insurance coverage for earthquake for equal sort of exposure, let's say 100 buildings in each province, and using the rates actually used in the market at the moment, and then we compared it with the average annual loss that we calculated for those provinces and counties to see that if their business is profitable in long term or not. And then we can see here that neither of businesses, even in the one in the low profile risk, is profitable. It's all loss. The loss is higher, much higher in the higher risk profile area, but it's still high in the even a low risk profile area. This means that the practice followed at the moment by the insurance industry in Iran could result in accumulated risk and loss in the medium term, long term, in future. And then this model, the old calculation that amounts large amounts of size of calculation has been done using, of course, the computer platform. We name it InsureCat. So it has two different functionality. The first one is for calculating those results, combining exposure, hazard, and vulnerability components to come up with output risk results. It is developed using the Go programming language, and database has been the PostgreSQL. For the spatial sort of data manipulation, we have used an add-in post-GIS, and as you can see, all the platform components are open source and not proprietary. And then another functionality of the of InsurCat is communicating the risk result with the client, which was at the first place the Iran NatCat risk pool as the first client, and secondary for the private sector insurance companies in the country that could be a potential client for the model and the calculation platform as well. So for the communication and platform side of the InsurCat, we have a web-based application. It has an architecture of RESTful, which gives it good flexibility, especially when the client wishes to embed it into its internal financial sort of systems. It has a front end and back end. The back end has been written by Go language, and the front end with the Angular framework. We can see the central insurance of Iran version of the InsurCat here. Sorry, we didn't have an English version. I've just used the Persian one. Here you can use the type of building, the year built here, the deductible percentages or as a flat figure, and here again the limit percentage or a flat figure for the limit. And then you can choose the location of the building here, or use the postal sort of postcode here. And then this shows you the pure premium ratio here with the coefficient of variation for underwriting purposes. We can also print it if you want to have sort of a copy. This is an example of the copy, the hard copy of the policy that provides all the information required, information on the type and characteristic of the building, the policy information, and also information on the insurance premium and the coefficient of variation, and also a map showing the location of the risk. And then for the sake of the market, the insurance market in Iran, we started developing another sort of a version of InsurCat, which is more sophisticated. It can browse any given exposure and then calculate the risk metrics and report it after that. We have sort of predicted other functionalities for InsurCat, although all of them not functional yet, but they are in the pipeline. The reinsurance part, the solvency capital requirement calculation, early warning and calculation for the claim using the broadband seismogram accelerogram of IIEES that could provide seismic claims, and also some typical and standard sort of icons like help and other things. And this is an example of the model that for a chosen location or account or anything or portfolio, it reports the different types of premium rate and coefficient of variance for underwriting purposes. So to conclude, an Iran earthquake model was developed by the collaboration of insurance industry, namely Central Insurance of Iran, the academia, the International Earthquake Institute of Earthquake Engineering and Seismology, IIEES, and also Insurance Research Center of Iran. The model and the platform has been designed according to the modern cat modeling standards, so using the norms in the market of the famous vendor companies. It provides risk metrics, AAL, EP, coefficient of variation at different levels. The model is going to support the Iran NatCat pool in designing a nationwide NatCat insurance coverage. And while the pool starts its job to provide those coverage for those national coverage, there are also opportunities for private sector insurers to provide supplementary sort of coverage for those buildings that received basic coverage from the pool. So the model also can be used by those companies. A new version of the InsurCat, a more sophisticated one, is in the pipeline. As I mentioned, there are other features like early claim estimation, insurance need assessment, risk-based solvency capital calculation, etc. have been taken into account and embedded to the new version. The software has been developed using open source modules and platforms, and the new version is going to adapt the formats and processes in the OASIS sort of calculation platforms as a common platform for the natural catastrophe insurance market worldwide. Okay, I was only one member of the sort of good number of people that collaborated in this project. You can see these names. The project was managed by Dr. Bastani in IIES and also other colleagues. Each of them took a part in them, for example, in different components: hazard, exposure, GIS calculations, database, collection of past loss data, and then other tasks that were involved in the development of the model and software. So thank you very much for your attention. I will be happy to answer your questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Very clear, very useful, definitely for the country and the experience that we get. If you can share it with others as well, hopefully other countries will follow as well. As usual, the floor is open. Whoever wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll unmute you. You can also write in the chat and I will read it aloud as well. I can see Tiziana has raised her hand. Tiziana, please.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I think it puts in context some of the learning that our students have been doing in their courses. I had a question around the vulnerability functions. You showed some curves for the different buildings and mentioned, for example, adapting existing vulnerability functions and changing the intensity measures, for example, to meet PGA. My question was, as you're using a Monte Carlo method, did you account for uncertainty in the vulnerability functions or just in the ground shaking?
Yes. Well, there were different types of for treating uncertainty in developing the vulnerability curves. The first one was the uncertainty coming from the results of different studies. So when we were combining different past vulnerability curves for each type of building, of course, there were a distribution of of numbers around the average, the mean curve. So yes, in the development of the vulnerability curves, we had considered some types of uncertainty, but we had not used it in the calculation of risks risk, but there will be another round of calculation to the risk for more sophisticated components, for example, for hazard component. And then we are planning to use those variation around the mean curve in the loss calculations in the next batch.
Okay, thank you. It will be interesting to see how much this influences basically the results. It'll be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Ashtiani, if you want to ask your question.
Okay. First, I would like to congratulate Hooman for the excellent work that he did, and it was expected from him. I have a question from you, Hooman. Compared to the previous models, insurance rating that was done in the past, I saw you have made the comparison. Can you elaborate on that comparison more, please?
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't have the maps to compare it visually, but I can describe it now. In the last calculation that we had for the seismic risk in Iran, we used the seismic model of EMA project, which was developed for the Middle East and I think, mainly Middle East, including different countries around Iran. In that model, the level of seismicity was much higher to the southeast of the country, just above the Oman Sea, with the border of Pakistan. Maybe that was a result of their sort of understanding on how macro faults could generate events. So anyway, since we had higher level of hazard, seismic hazard in those areas, then the risk maps were also different, putting more emphasis in the southeastern Iran. And also in terms of vulnerability curves that we used, it was a sort of the amount of losses were less in that calculation, but still comparable to the results that we obtained in the new model. So in general, if I want to conclude that there were definitely similarities between the patterns and distribution of risk as well as hazard in the country, but there were some, let's say, minor differences in some areas that exist. That's all I can provide with at the moment.
Okay. I can see that Camila is asking a question in the chat. So she's asking, how do you generate the synthetic earthquake catalog? And have you considered the epistemic and aleatory uncertainties in these catalogs? I'm sure like this was part of like gathering lots of data which already been generated, but if you have any comment on that, the earthquake catalogs that you have, how did you generate it then?
Yeah. Well, we follow the smooth seismicity sort of area model for the seismicity in Iran. You know, dividing the country into different seismic provinces, seismic zones, and at each seismic zone, we simulated seismic events evenly, not evenly, actually based on a Gaussian sort of distribution. And then we come up with those synthetic sort of catalogs. So we had information. We had good information about the instrumental catalog in different areas because there are lots of accelerograms in the country that recording those seismic information. We used them, we redistributed them to the different seismic zones, and at each zones we simulated the seismic synthetic seismic catalog using the Monte Carlo approach, and a Gaussian distribution around past earthquake events in those zones.
Okay, fair enough. Dina, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, Hooman, for such an interesting presentation and such a nice overview of the insurance model approach. I was just wondering about your exposure data, and in particular, whether you mentioned, for instance, about a large number of masonry buildings, especially for residential characteristics, for residential use. But I was wondering whether you are actually looking at also different type of occupancy and end use, and whether you are let's say applying modifiers to your basic vulnerability curves when considering the insurance exposure, because ultimately I assume that it would be commercial or public use building that will be more likely to underwrite insurance premiums.
Yeah. Yeah, yes. Thank you very much, Dina, for your question. Well, we faced the availability of data in developing our exposure model. The statistical center of EWAN only provides information on residential dwellings and not even buildings. So the most reliable information that we had was only information on the type, year built of the residential dwellings and not commercial and industrial. Well, let's say, luckily, the national NatCat insurance pool, based on the law of 2020, is obliged to, required to provide protection only for residential buildings. So so what we supposed to do was only looking at the risk of residential buildings, and we could do that because the data exists. However, if we want to use the same system and process to come up with the risk, the commercial or industrial facilities, as what we did in a project with GEM in 2018, which was published, yes. I think. The data should be gathered here. The data should be gathered from other sources rather than the statistical center of EWA. For example, and the data are not could be secondary data as well. So a higher level of uncertainty will be attached to those results. At the moment, we are trying to increase the accuracy of the risk results for residential, because it's been required by the law and by the CAT pool. But if the demand appears in the insurance market, then we could do the same job using the other sources of data for coming up with the premium rates for commercial and industrial facilities and buildings as well.
Thank you very much for your answer. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a question regarding a kind of a concern regarding the penetration rate of insurance. 2.7%, it's very low.
Yeah.
One question is this for natural disasters, or is this just for earthquakes?
penetration is for the entire insurance industry. So the one for even for the home insurance and Nat Cat insurance is even lower, a proportion of that.
Okay, so it gets even worse. Why do you think this is happening? Is it because the product for them to calculate the losses didn't existed, or is it like a cultural thing? What is the main reason for such a low number?
Yes. Yeah, the problem has different aspects. I think the most important one is the cultural aspect. People have different concerns, different important concerns in life, rather than protecting themselves to natural hazards. Also, their perception of the risk is not real, so they might spend money, much higher amount of money on other risks that are not that high compared to natural hazards, but because the perception of risk for natural hazard is lower, they don't put that money for buying coverage against natural hazards. Maybe a part of the problem would be would lie in the insurance industry as well. So in terms of claim management and payment of the claims, there might be some unsatisfactory as well. So different reasons are behind that. But after each great seismic or flood event in the country, we witness a surge in the demand for the coverage, and then it alleviates over time until the next event. But my expectation is that when the national scheme for natural catastrophe starts to provide coverage, this will contribute to the awareness, public awareness towards natural hazards. So I can expect that demand will increase to some extent.
Okay, good to hear. That's very important, and hopefully that percentage goes very, very high. We have passed 1 o'clock, but if you're happy and Hooman is available, we will continue the questions with Dr. Ashiani if you want to ask your question.
I just want to elaborate on your question, to help Hooman to answer it. That 2.7% is the engineering related in insurance. It's not the health coverage or the automobile. I mean, the other one. The second thing that because the reason there's a low rate of the penetration, because the government has been a free insurer in the past, and it still is. Means in all disasters, that happened in the past from 1990, that the Manjil BAM, the government has provided replacement cost of the housing, and not full replacement, but for example in the villages something like 60 meter or 80 meter or 100 meter, and subsidized it. As long as the government is a free insurer in the flood case, in the earthquake case, therefore people do not have incentive to go for insurance, because they know that if something happened, government would cover it. Now this has been transferred to the insurance pool right now. Now with the insurance pool in place, now the money that the government has allocated for disaster response for this part, it's been allocated now to the insurance pool. And if today something happened again, insurance pool, without people paying anything yet, they will cover the losses. So as long as the government remains as a free insurer, that remains. In the catastrophe pool that the Iran has, we are supposed to start with 10% contribution from people, 90% from the government, and would continue in 10 years period that the contribution of people will be 90% and government will be 10%. Therefore, we hope with that, this insurance, the Iran Natural Catastrophe Insurance, the market for the complementary insurance would come up. That, for example, this insurance covers certain amount of losses. I mean, for example, still It has not been decided, but it will be something like a, something like 80 square or 100 square meter, dwelling. Therefore, if you want your full house replacement, therefore you have to have a complementary insurance. Like in health insurance, the government provides minimum health insurance to everybody, and everybody has two insurance: the complementary insurance and national insurance. That's going to be the case.
Okay, very good to hear. It looks like a very good plan. Hopefully they can implement it, and really in 10 years that can be done.
Inshallah.
I have another question from Shima, and she's asking, why haven't you considered the 2,475-year return period in your seismic hazard maps? Just guessing you haven't showed it, or it wasn't of interest?
Could you repeat the questions? My internet is not really stable.
The question is regarding the return period of the hazard maps. They're asking why you don't have the 2,475 year return period, so the 2%, let's say.
Okay. Now, these are just examples of the hazard maps. In the event-based seismic risk analysis, we actually don't use the actual return periods. We use events. So these are just realization of those earthquakes and the intensity to show, to have an idea about the distribution of hazard level in the country. We can produce those maps, but they're not necessary for the moment.
Okay, perfect. I won't bother you more. I'll just have one more question. First of all, it's a very good idea of implementing this model later on in IIEES and making it more open source. People will contribute more and it will improve. I have a question going back to the fragility functions. I saw that you have categorized them in 24 types, different typologies and different heights. Have you considered different qualities, years of construction, whether they've been seismically designed, something like that?
Yeah. Okay, so let me, fortunately we have the information here. So as you can see in the title of the page of this slide, the 24 building site is a product of 6 types of construction material, which are steel, RC, masonry, adobe, wood, and unknown, multiplied by 4 classes of year built, which could be indirectly related to the quality of construction. So that 24 is the product of these 2, 6, and 4 numbers. Unfortunately, the number of stories is not collected information in the national census. So we had to assume, consider different assumptions for different types of buildings. For example, for the masonry and adobe buildings, we assume that the height of the buildings are low, let's say between 1 to 3 stories. But for steel and RC, at the medium height from 4 to 8 stories, on a very average, let's say, assumptions. So yes, these different characteristics of the buildings were taken into account coming up with these 24 building types.
Okay, perfect. And hopefully, as years pass, you can improve the fragility curves as your students and scientists will generate more and more fragility curves, more realistic. And hopefully one day we see spectral acceleration as well as PGAs as well. So yeah, again, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I will just share. Yes. Please.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It was an honor to present the result of this project for other people around the world, including those scientists in UCO.
Perfect. So as usual, I'll just promote the coming session. So today we had development of an insurance earthquake risk model for residential buildings in Iran by Dr. Hooman Motamed from the International Institute of Earthquake Engineering and Seismology. Tomorrow, as part of the CGE seminars, we have digital twins, the MON structure systems, which is in person as well, so in Chadwick 05, as well as the Zoom link as well. Whoever wants to join, please feel free. As part of EPICentre seminars, I will take a short break and we'll come back on 2nd of March and we'll talk about tsunamis and pushover toolkit by Jonas Sells. As usual, all of our clips are available in our website as well as the YouTube channel. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Hooman Motamed, for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you everyone for joining us. Again, to my countrymen, خیلی لطف کردین تشریف آوردین و انشالله به زودی ببینیمتون. So thank you very much and I'll end this session. See you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.